Howdy, y'all. We are doing the Lesbian Leaders live stream tonight. My name is Nana Mergani. I am the Programs Associate for Charlotte Pride.
I'm Ray Indigo, who pronounces they and he.
I am Tatiana. My pronouns is she, her, they, them.
And before we start, I want to do a quick recap of some of the other events that have been done for Pride Week so far. We've done the scavenger hunt, which is going on up until August 2nd. You can go to LGBTQ supportive businesses and get little goodie bags similar to the ones that you would have gotten in the in-person festival. We did the interfaith ceremony when the theme for the interfaith ceremony was Rise Up. We did the Animal Crossing live stream on Mondays where people showed off their virtual villages, and it was really, really cute. And we did the Transforming History event yesterday. The festival and parade are going to happen from August 1st to August 2nd. Those are both upcoming events. And then we still have the COVID relief program where you could get $100 sent to you via PayPal if you have been furloughed or have lost work as a result of COVID-19. Applications for the second round of that open on August 3rd at 10 a.m. This is applicable for anyone living in Mecklenburg County or in surrounding areas who's LGBTQ identified, who need support as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. So yeah, I think we can go ahead and get started. So the live stream topic today is lesbian leaders. This is a conversation about women loving women who've been erased from history. We can go ahead and move to the again. So we wanted to start with this conversation by talking about what causes the erasure of women in LGBTQ history. So part of the first question we should ask ourselves when we talk about erasure of women from LGBTQ history is who is involved in recording history and who has tangible structural power within the world of historical archiving, because the answer is not women a lot of times. It's also not trans folks a lot of times either. When it comes to historical archiving, a lot of times the people who have power and relevance in this world are men, and cis men at that. Also, the role of women is often minimalized and seen in support of men's activist work rather than a separate structure. And then history is not free from patriarchal influence, and history in the most mainstream understanding of it is inherently male-centric because of the reasons listed above. And then there can also be, in specific conversations surrounding butch lesbians, some confusion regarding their identity and sexuality and their gender, to the point where, like, they, despite them acknowledging themselves as women for their entire life, following their passing, there's like confusion surrounding their pronouns, there's confusion surrounding their identity, and the autonomy of them being able to control their gender identity and their sexuality for themselves is removed in a lot of ways. And we can move on to the next slide. So why is it important to recognize the work that LGBTQ women have done for the movement? Partially because it's just an inherently inaccurate telling to present LGBTQ history as either male or cis-centered. Our community and the freedom fighters within them are diverse in sexuality, gender, and presentation. The rewriting of history to exclude the impact of women and femmes is used to perpetuate racism and misogyny and denounce the idea that women can and should be seen as community leaders and freedom fighters and should be trusted as such. Telling the story of powerful women negates the idea that women are inherently submissive or do work with the ultimate goal of supporting activism led by men. And it is inappropriate to strip someone of the gender they've claimed for themselves without their consent. I think this is never done with negative intentions, but at the same time, it can be really, really complex and like inherently problematic to try to determine someone's gender for them, especially following their passing. And we just should offer LGBTQ women more respect than that and the autonomy to make those determinations surrounding their gender on their own. And then Someone asked us to talk a little bit more about the divide between trans women and cis lesbians. It's Heather Marie Dunn. Hi, Heather. And she said, as a trans lesbian, I feel torn between two marginalized identities. I think this is an important conversation topic, and I'd be open to talking about it towards the end of this presentation a little bit. So we're going to move through this, and then we're going to address this question. I just wanted to let you know that I did see it. So we can start with talking about Stormy. So who are we honoring? The first person that we're honoring is Stormy DeLarveray. She is a Black butch lesbian who was born in New Orleans but lived most of her life in New York City and Brooklyn. Her initial encounters with the police are said to have started the Stonewall riots. And to elaborate a little more on what that encounter was, we can move to the next slide. So she worked as a bouncer at several different gay clubs. Police were doing their weekly routine raids where they would arrest anybody who was wearing 3 articles of clothing that they considered different from the gender that the police assigned to them. Within this routine raid, Stormy was referred to as a homophobic slur by one of the officers, and he put his hands on her and hit her. In response, Stormy punched him in the face. And he hit her in the head with a bully club, which is basically a nightstick, and handcuffed her. After all this happened, her head was bleeding, and she turned to the crowd and she shouted, "Why don't you do something?" After a long struggle, she was dragged outside to a paddy wagon. And a very long struggle, by the way. Stormy fought her ass off against this cop. So after a very long struggle, she was dragged into a paddy wagon outside. And that's basically when shit really started to go down. This reportedly set off the 6 days of protest that we now know as the Stonewall riots. And then following those riots and the impact that they had for our community, exactly 1 year after this, on June 28th, 1970, the first Pride Parade took place in New York. So the impact that happened as a result of that really caused the modern Pride movement as we know it. Stormy went on to continue to commit to serve the lesbian community for the next 60 years of her life. The girls in New York who knew her described her as androgynous, tall, handsome, and legally armed. And she patrolled the lesbian bars, keeping her baby girls, as she referred to them, safe as they partied and enjoyed each other and loved on each other. She died in her sleep at the age of 93 in 2014. She was beloved by her community, and she was referred to as a gay superhero. We wanted to thank Stormy for every single thing that she's done for us and for the modern Pride movement. And we want to tell her to rest, and we just wish that Stormy does rest in power. So I wanted to ask y'all, how do we feel after hearing Stormy's story?
I would like to say that I would like to be referenced as a gay superhero.
I also would like that on my tombstone when I go.
I just want to.
I like androgynous, handsome, legally armed.
Yeah, that as well.
Wow.
I think she's obviously she paved the way for a lot of what we're currently seeing in today's world. She stood up for a lot of things that many people wouldn't have done in her time, and paid the price, got beat by the officers, and then essentially called out the folks watching, that bystander effect where you see something bad happening, yet you freeze in time and not really react or respond to any form of violence or anything that you is incorrect, and it was then where people started to act. So I can resonate with a lot of that, just with what we're seeing in today's world, just being out there, with the protests and what we're seeing in the media. Just not very much has changed.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think Stormy, hearing her story made me really made me really think about the safety and like the love and care that you get in like Black women communities.
Yeah.
It made me really just think about the Black women who've loved on me and like who have protected me in my communities, made sure that I was safe growing up queer. And so I always think about it like, you know, Black women's safety always should start some cataclysmic,
Yeah.
like we should always protect Black femmes' safety.
Yeah.
And then like I think that like something so poignant, something like a change in history, a dime is like, you know, from someone's safety, from someone saying, do something. And I
Yeah.
think like I honor her, and so like I think it's very important to honor our ancestors and speak our names. So I'm just very, very grateful to like be in to hear my chosen ancestor, you know, name being spoken and honored in 2020, like, you
Yeah.
know, while we're still violently resisting. So rest in power.
Yeah. I also like, for me, it was really powerful that she made the call for accountability by saying, like, why don't y'all do something? And it actually resulted in people caring and people saying, like, we're going to stand up for this Black femme safety because we should, right? Like, it's really important to recognize the modern pride movement as we know it now existed because police attempted to run siege and attack and beat on a Black femme, and she called for this to stop.
Yeah.
And that's really representative of a lot of what we're going through today.
Yeah, and also shows community.
Yeah.
How community keeps their people safe.
Who keeps us safe?
We keep us safe.
Right?
Absolutely. You know, where, you know, these folks are given, you know, these officers are given you know, a role to keep the community safe, yet, you know, consistently, and even, you know, in history, it has been, you know, recorded that police brutality has always existed, and community has always stepped up to keep those safe, you know, to keep our trans folks safe, to keep our queer folks safe, to keep, you know, our Black community safe, our Latino community safe. So it just shows, you know, it's frustrating because, you know, this is, you know, essentially like over 50 years ago, and we're here today. Their lessons have not been learned in this system, and it's also a little bit, you know, frustrating and disappointing.
Yeah. Like when I think of Stormy, I think of protection. I think of how she was protected, and she went on to protect other women and femmes in the queer community for the next 60 years following. Like that's the one word that pops into my head when I think of her story, like protection. Look at what happens when we keep each other safe and what is built as a result. So my next question is going to be, how do we honor Stormy and the work that she's done that now is building the movement that we know is the modern pride movement today? How do we kind of continue to do this work for our community while also honoring what she's done for our community?
I think it's by continuing to fight for your community and to fight for people's safety.
Yeah.
That's
Absolutely.
how we honor it. You know, we read about her story and many other stories of how they were able to, you know, create change. Whether it seems minor because we're still here today doing the same thing, but at the same time, you know, these are the folks that we read about and look up to, as far as these are the people who paved the way for me to be here today. This is why I can dress the way I dress and not be assaulted, you know, in the streets, you know. Wow, that's still happening. And that's, you know, a shame, but, you know, that's how we continue to honor, is by, you know, continuing to protect those folks, continuing to fight for their rights and fight for their safety.
Yeah.
And I would say, like, also, like, speaking and honoring our ancestors' names whenever we have the capacity to. I think it's very important as a Black person for me to honor those who have came before me, because without their life, I would not exist. And so I think it's very important to do that. And also, you know, I think the radical love that Stormy had for her community and herself is something that we need to imagine and employ in our everyday lives.
Absolutely.
And so I think with that love and that radical transformation, new worlds are built.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's how we can honor her legacy and her commitment, her care, and dedication for our people.
Yeah, absolutely. Because Stormy is very powerful. Like, as I was reading historical accounts about her, when her friends were approached and asked, like, did Stormy hit a cop? They were like, well, I don't know because I wasn't there, but that sounds like something she would do.
You know, if someone asked me that about you, I'd be like, yeah, sounds about right. I'm not going to question it.
I was reading comments. We can go ahead and move on to Barbara Smith. Now, Barbara Smith is a socialist, an educator, and an author. She helped basically usher in Black feminist theory as we know it today into the mainstream. She started the Boston National Black Feminist Organization after going to a National Black Feminist Organization retreat in Rochester, along with her sister Beverly and Chicago activist Demetria Frazier. So the Boston National Black Feminist Organization became independent in 1975 because they weren't getting a lot of support from the national branch. And they went on to become the Combahee River Collective. This collective was instrumental in addressing the failures of white feminist-led movements and white-led LGBTQ movements to address the issues that affected Black LGBTQ folks. This is like one of the real first instances we've seen of like separatism and acknowledgement that like the LGBTQ movement that as it existed in the 90s was not acknowledging the needs of Black and brown folks, especially Black and brown women. So for Barbara, this collective went on to coin the term identity politics, derived directly from their experiences as Black women. This is a term that we still use in queer academia and queer organizing spaces today. This collective was known for fighting against domestic abuse, sexual assault, and fought for reproductive rights and autonomy within reproductive work. And then the collective disbanded in 1980s as a result of some infighting. Folks who were not lesbian, who were a part of this collective, had some issues with the radical lesbian ideology that was being pushed. And they also just had an issue working with radical Black lesbians, period. As time started to go on, some of the folks who were not involved in the queer community started to feel like some hesitation surrounding this work, which resulted in a lot of infighting, which resulted in the collective disbanding in the 1980s. However, Barbara was not done after the collective disbanded. She went on to work with Audre Lorde to create Kitchen Table Women of Color Press. This press was one of the first American publishing companies created by women of color for women of color. Barbara was also so instrumental in the 90s in addressing the rapid and violent whitewashing and dismissal of Black queer activists from queer spaces in the 90s. A good quote that I felt was very, very powerful that came directly from Barbara is, when lesbian and gay men of color urged the gay leadership to make connections between heterosexism and issues like police brutality, racial violence, homelessness, reproductive freedom, and violence against women and children, the standard dismissive response is, those are not our issues. At a time when the gay movement is under unprecedented public scrutiny, lesbians and gay men of color and others committed to anti-racist organizing are asking, does the gay and lesbian movement want to create a just society for everyone, or does it only want to eradicate that last little glitch that makes life difficult for privileged white male queers?
Oof. 100.
Oof.
Yeah. We can talk. We can.
Pen.
I know we can talk specifically about that statement too, because it's a very, very powerful one.
It was a very powerful statement, and it is something that we very much see and feel in today's world.
Absolutely.
Where people tend to dismiss a lot of what's happening because it doesn't directly impact them, or it gets within their comfort zone, and they just choose to disregard. So to the comment that was made earlier about just trans women and lesbian women. There is still such a divide within the queer community.
Yes.
And queer folks marginalizing other queer folks.
Yes.
Because they can't, see past their own, I guess, way of being, so very much feel what was said here, because like for myself, I believe we need to create a just society for all, not just for, like people who look like me, talk like me, dress like me, that's not it.
Yeah. I like intersectionality, especially when we're talking about LGBTQ organizing work, is imperative, right? Because like being Black and LGBTQ, you're more likely to exist in poverty. So you're more likely to experience the effects of homelessness. So you're more likely to experience, because poverty also plays into whether or not you're going to experience police brutality as well. So like you're put in these hyper marginalized positions to where like we can't talk about our Black queerness without also speaking about poverty, without also speaking about reproductive rights issues, without also speaking about racialized violence, without also speaking about homelessness. So it's really, really difficult to enter into like white LGBTQ-led spaces that are like, oh, well, let's focus on marriage equality. When I'm just like, there's Black kids right now who are in the streets, who got kicked out by their parents at 16, and Salvation Army or like some of these other shelters won't accept them because of their sexuality. It can just be really, really complex when we refuse to focus on the voices of Black women and Black gay men, when we know that the movement that we exist under now, like whether you want to call it the modern Pride movement, the modern LGBTQ liberation movement, all of those movements, both separately and like intertwined, exist as a result of the work that Black queer folks have done, and more specifically Black trans folks and Black trans women have done. And like Black gender nonconforming folks as well. So it can be, this quote really resonates with me today as well, because like I still do see a lot of this where for some people, their goal is to eradicate that last little bit of disprivilege that makes their life difficult. Because if they weren't gay, they would just be a white cis man able to navigate 100% as a white cis man. And their goal isn't really to create a safe world for our entire community. Because it's a very diverse community.
Very.
So our next slide is just thanking Barbara for the work that she's done. Barbara is living peacefully in Albany, New York now. She is 73. We wanted to say thank you for helping us coin the terms that we still use to this day, like identity politics. Thank you for pushing our issues and the issues of Black queer folks to the forefront, and to pushing the issues that affect women of color to the forefront. Thank you for standing up for yourself and consequently ending up standing up for all of us. And thank you for reminding us that this movement was built by Black and brown queer voices, and why we cannot allow these voices to be washed out of history. And then this is basically where we talk about both Stormy and Barbara's story and think like, what do these stories tell us?
For me, these stories tell us that we have fought a lot only to go not to go very far, unfortunately. But I think they provided us with the tools that we needed so that we can continue doing what we do today. But we're still fighting the same fight. Just, turn on the TV, look at the news, Black trans women continue to die at a high rate.
Absolutely.
Their life expectancy is 35. How many of us on here, on this live, living today is well above 35 and have been able to live a full life?
Right.
Where these women are lives are consistently cut short. And that's not fair. I can't go on living as a queer woman knowing that, my queer trans sister is only going to live so many birthdays before her life is cut short.
Right. I feel like there's like an air of frustration that it's like, wow, like these are stories we're hearing about from the 90s and from the 60s, and like they resonate with their experience or lived experiences today. Like there's frustration in that, but also like there's a lot of beauty in the amount of resistance in hearing this. Like even in the 70s, there were queer femmes who were punching police in the face. Like even in these times, like so far back, like because a lot of people like to do the argument of like, well, back in the 70s, back in the 80s, they weren't, burning things down. They were protesting peacefully. And it's like,
absolutely not.
That's such
like
They burned
everything.
down.
Yeah, like in the Stonewall riots, they literally
Right.
burned Stonewall down.
Yeah.
But like that really speaks to the reality of like what protest and revolution is. It's not this inherent, like it's not going to be this thing that's inherently comfortable for everybody. Even in the 70s, even in Stormy's story, even in the stories of like folks who aren't on this PowerPoint, like Marsha P. Johnston. These stories are not ones of folks protesting peacefully and the police agreeing to leave them alone. Like that's not really what's happening. What's happening is folks living under like siege who are making strong, determined statements to say, I will be heard, and doing what they need to do to be heard. So yeah, like I think a lot of this can be taken, and the strength and power that they've given us behind their words, or in Stormy's case, and behind her literal fists, like we can take on and hold on to as we do this work.
Yeah, I think a lot about the tradition of Sankofa, of looking back to our past in order to move forward. We have to really, we have so much traditions to turn to, so much history, so much resistance that can like not only ground us but guide us into our into this new world that we're imagining and dreaming and scheming of. I think that I'm so grateful and so as we know, our history is erased so much, and so I'm just so grateful that we have these names, we have these faces and people to turn to and people to speak to. I'm like, yes, I'm so grateful, but we still have so much work to do. I think that self-determination and that what's the word?
Courage?
Huh?
Courage?
I think so.
Okay.
I think so. I think that's in order to move forward. I think that's it's needed right now.
Yeah, I think so. Like I'm excited to get to the place in history where like stories like these are surprising rather than like correlated with our real life lived experience. To where I can read this and be like, that's crazy that a police officer would hit a Black femme. Like, that doesn't sound like realistic. Like, I can't believe that's what history was like. Rather than like, oh, like this is what's happening today, I love these stories, and I can't wait for these stories to truly feel like history, right? Like this is something that was fought against rather than just like our reality now, but just existing at a different time.
Yeah.
Well, we're pretty much done with the presentation at this point.
Any questions in the comments?
There are some questions in the comment. I want to answer Heather's question that was asked earlier about, I'm scrolling up a little bit, to talk about the divide between trans women and cis lesbians. So I will say, like, transphobia is a lot of what perpetuates most of this. Like, there really wouldn't be a divide if transphobia wasn't like validated with the term. I feel like it's validated with the term TERF. So like trans exclusive radical feminist, like you can't actually be a radical feminist if you're trans exclusive. So like I feel like there are, and this isn't speaking to the lesbian community, speaking about the lesbian community as a whole, there is harm that's caused by TERFs and the influence that they hold within the lesbian community.
And I think it's within just the trans community and the cis queer community. There's a divide that still exists that needs to be addressed, and a lot of like what you just said, it just really comes from transphobia. And I mean, I myself always try to address it and being truly inclusive. But you're gonna have those folks that are just not with it for and it's unfortunate because like the queer community is such a beautiful, colorful, vibrant community, and to only partake in just a portion of it that makes you feel comfortable is sad.
Yeah, they're
Yeah.
bigoted, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Very.
Yeah, because I think queerness to me feels like freedom.
yeah.
And so I think that anytime that queerness is threatened with transphobia, that's not freedom. That's putting someone else in some sort of bondage. Like that doesn't need to happen.
Why are lesbians getting a bad rep? So I
wouldn't argue that this is happening either. That lesbians are inherently getting a bad rep from the trans community. The issue is like transphobic lesbians do exist, and we have to have that conversation. That doesn't mean that every lesbian is a transphobic lesbian, but there is something in the lesbian community called a turf where people do get away with. And yeah, Heather, like I do agree. There are some cis lesbians that just don't see trans women as women, and like transphobia within the queer community does exist, and it is extremely prevalent as well. And it's disappointing, right? Because for folks within our community, we expect them not to perpetuate cisphobia, but a lot of folks are still cis, so they're still going to do it. All we can do is continue to work to combat that. Do y'all have any like suggestions for ways that we can kind of bridge that gap? I mean, for me, I ask questions.
Yeah.
Like when I meet people who are just like, oh, well, you know, they're clearly perpetuating like violently transphobic ideology. I'm just like, well, why? No, but like, why? Why do you care about what someone's genitalia looks like? Like, I don't really let people get out of that conversation without acknowledging like what you're saying is explicitly harmful.
Yeah.
All right. If we don't have any more questions, I'll give it maybe like 30 to 45 more seconds. We'll sign off. Thank you for everyone in the comments. I'm doing like a quick read through to see if there are any other questions that we missed. But yeah, thank y'all for participating in this conversation. We'll see y'all tomorrow at 6 p.m. for our Queer Liberation is Not Exclusive to the U.S. conversation. We'll be talking about liberation efforts that existed that are not U.S.-centric in Latinx communities and countries. And I think I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think it's about time for us to sign off. Thank y'all so much for being present for this conversation. Bye-bye.